Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the third weekend of November 2024. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to the headlines. We'll present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news from our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. This week on the Radio Hour, we'll look at President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet picks. We'll hear about the business groups calling for the CHIPS Act money to be released, and we'll discuss the battles for congressional leadership. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet picks, it's Dan McCaleb.
President-elect Donald Trump has been busy this week filling out his cabinet. U.S. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida for Secretary of State, Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida as Attorney General, former Hawaii U.S. Rep. Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence, South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem as Secretary of Homeland Security, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Health and Human Services Secretary. I could go on, but first let's bring in Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, all of Trump's cabinet picks need to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate, which will be controlled by Republicans with a 53-47 majority. Let's start with what you think some of the highlights or lowlights of these selections are, or any that I didn't mention.
Dan, the Avengers are assembling. That's what it feels like here with this very unusual, very talented, very famous team. Now, of course, the Democrats, this is more like Thanos is Trump, and he is ready to destroy the world. I guess depending on what side of the aisle you're on, you'll look at it differently. But Trump is doing kind of what everyone thought he would do last time and what a lot of Trump supporters wanted him to do last time. Last time, they wanted Trump to come into office and shake things up, bring in a lot of new ideas, a lot of new faces, change the status quo, take the positions of power from, the swamp, as he often referred to it, and give the power to the people, to different voices. And last time he mostly kind of went with establishment picks, and Trump himself admitted that the people he put in charge maybe were his undoing. And so this time around, he is doing the complete opposite. He's putting a lot of controversial picks. So let's say highs and lows. I mean, one high in all this, Dan, is I really love to see the bipartisan nature of this. I think it's good for the country to have a couple of Democrats in here. Historically, that is how it's been. In recent history, it's not that way. But I think it's really good for Trump. I think it's really good for the America First movement to have some Democrats, some independents brought into leadership to create this coalition, to make it, create this vision that America is unified. I think, people say Trump can be divisive, and maybe he is, but he has Democrats in his cabinet. So I think that's a high for him. That's a win for him. That's a win for the Republican Party. It's a win for the country to have bipartisan leadership in the administration. Another, let's say, I don't want to say anything's a low necessarily, because that's sort of my opinion, but I think this Matt Gaetz for DOJ is going to be a home run or a strikeout. Yeah, I mean, Gaetz has a pretty questionable history. He's had an ethics investigation. Now, some think he was targeted wrongly for some kind of political persecution. Others think he's guilty as sin, and it's about to be exposed. And I think time will tell. The answer on that one is we'll see. We'll see if Matt Gaetz is able to just clean up the Justice Department and prosecute some Democrats and establishment insiders that Trump supporters have wanted prosecuted for a long time. Or maybe he'll be totally exposed and some leaks will come out and he'll have to resign and it'll be a disaster. We'll see.
Yeah, Gaetz, the House Ethics Committee investigating him for alleged sexual misconduct, they were set to release, and I referred to him as Representative Matt Gaetz at the top. He resigned his seat shortly after Trump nominated him as Attorney General, so he's no longer a representative there. Some have said it's because the House Ethics Committee was about to release a report on that ethics investigation. Now he's not a representative. There are calls for them to still release that report. We'll see if that happens. You mentioned Democrats. Tulsi Gabbard, former Democrat turned independent. Robert F. Kennedy wanted to run for president as a Democrat. The Democratic Party blocked him out of that process, so he decided to run as an independent. Those are two of the Democrats you mentioned who have been appointed by Trump. Two names I didn't mention, Casey, and it has to do with the new department, the Department of Government Efficiency. Trump named Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk to head that agency. That, I think, is an interesting thing and maybe something that has been needed for years or decades. What do you think of that?
And this is one of those picks. I mean, this, if anything, is for the base. This is for the base. They love Ramaswamy. They love Musk, of course. I mean, and they love the idea of government efficiency. I mean, for whatever reason, everybody generally acknowledges that the government is highly inefficient, has corruption in it. The wasting of taxpayers' dollars is rampant. But I think people, we've talked about this, Dan. I think people have given up on the idea that it could actually be cleaned up. Because for so many years, Republicans ran on cleaning it up, and they really had mixed results. They really didn't. They did some, but it wasn't permanent. And now the debt is out of control, around $35 trillion. And Republicans have mostly stopped talking about it. And the Democrats never, back in the 90s, they did. Bill Clinton, talked about government efficiency, but since then it hasn't really been a big part of their platform. And now Republicans don't run on, efficient spending or government efficiency or cutting the deficit hardly anymore. So I think Americans had given up on it. And so to see this out of nowhere, which is kind of interesting because Trump himself did run up the deficits and debt, when he was in office. But I think this is another bipartisan win, Dan, because I think a lot of independents and Democrats also agree that the government is inefficient. Polling shows that. And so there's kind of two ways, Dan, and I want to hear what you think about this, but I think there's really two ways that they can cut government efficiency, just big picture. And one is going to be a lot more successful than the other. And we have a list because we just put up a list at thecentersquare.com of some examples of kinds of government waste. But there's the little examples that are really entertaining and just absolutely ridiculous. They get a lot of headlines, like, giving money to study hamsters fighting on steroids. And no, I did not make that up. Or, giving, I have one on the website. It's something like $426,000 to encourage Latino men to exercise. Or $200,000 spent by the Department of Defense on Starbucks espresso machines. So these get the headlines, but these are kind of small amounts of money. They are signs of rampant waste and abuse, but they're small amounts of money. And I think they're going to target those, and that'll be good press coverage for them. But then, Dan, the second part is there are entire departments of the government that could just be lopped off. I mean, it could be totally cleaned out. And Ramaswamy in interviews has talked about just cleaning out entire departments. RFK has talked about cleaning out entire departments at the FDA. Elon Musk famously fired about 80% of his staff when he bought Twitter. And, last I checked, the site is still running just fine. So the question is it going to be these kind of fun spot check reduction in grant programs that are high profile, or are they going to be able to successfully, clean up billions of dollars of spending by ending entire, wings of the government?
It will be interesting to follow how all of these nominees shake out. Casey, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all of the developments when it comes to Trump's cabinet at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the CHIPS Act funding, we'll go to Eliana Kernodle.
The Ohio Chamber of Commerce and nearly 20 business groups from 4 states want the Biden administration to start handing out money from the CHIPS Act immediately. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's JD Davidson. JD, who's involved and what are they asking for?
Well, it's the Ohio Chamber and several business groups, and the CHIPS Act was passed in 2022 to kind of provide incentives for major microchip manufacturers to start making chips back in the United States again. Why they're pushing the Biden administration? Because there's only about 2 months left in the Biden administration, and the upcoming Trump administration does not like the CHIPS Act. And there's fear across the country that Congress and President-elect Trump will end it. And that will create significant hardships in at least 10 states: Ohio, Oregon, New Mexico, Arizona, New York, Texas, Michigan, Wisconsin, Colorado, and Indiana all have major planned investments that have started because of CHIPS Act promises.
So I know one of Trump's talking points throughout the election was bringing back American jobs. What's his problem with the CHIPS Act?
Well, it's interesting. The main thing that I hear, Trump doesn't like it. House Speaker Mike Johnson has said he expects the House to kill it when the new Congress takes effect. He has started to walk that back. But the main argument is it blows the deficit, which certainly that's understandable. I understand that. I think most people understand that. The next line on that is, so does every program proposed by Trump. So I feel like a lot of people believe that argument's kind of hollow. The impact that it has, I think, is more important. So in Ohio, Intel has planned a $4 billion investment, started construction on 2 major manufacturing plants that will be, what officials say, around 4,000 significant jobs, not counting the construction jobs that go along with it, but 4,000 jobs. That's a big deal. That's a big deal in any state. That's a big deal in any community. But what's happened is it has created such a fever in central Ohio that has bled out into communities an hour away from where this facility will be. And they've started sinking their own money in school upgrades, infrastructure improvements, housing developments. So all of these things have started to happen. And the process for delivering the CHIPS Act money is slow to begin with. So Intel's been kind of stuck in kind of no man's land in Ohio and Arizona. Just kind of, okay, we need these reimbursements to be able to move forward. And it's a slow process. That's kind of understandable. That's how all of this stuff usually works, especially when you're talking about a 3 to 4 year process on a major manufacturing plant. But communities have invested, small communities have invested millions. And for a small community, that's a big deal. New schools have been built in school districts expecting this onslaught of people to come in. So it'll be interesting to see what plays out over the next couple months if the Biden administration will go ahead and start handing out this money for fear that there could be a congressional or a presidential stop on it or not. Also, what the other interesting part of this is, several pro-Trump Republicans are heavily invested in the CHIP Act. Ted Cruz out of Texas. Sherrod Brown in Ohio was a major force behind this because of Intel. He lost his race to newcomer Bernie Moreno, a pro-Trump Republican, who in his first news conference since winning said the commitments from the CHIP Act need to go forward. That needs to happen. We need to do that. It's important for Ohio. It's important for the country. And then he said, only if President Trump wants it to. So there are a lot of Republicans in the House and the Senate that are going to kind of follow Trump's lead on whether or not to move forward with this. The impact that it's had on Intel so far, in Arizona, Intel put $32 billion into a semiconductor facility in the state. That was on the promise the federal government would kick in $8.5 billion. That $32 million goes towards facilities in Ohio, Arizona, Oregon, and New Mexico in return for $8.5 billion. The money's coming in slowly. In August, Intel announced it's laying off 15% of its total workforce. Its stock's taken a hit. I know in Ohio, major infrastructure projects that the state committed to doing this. And that's kind of how in Ohio, the subsidies are tax credits and then infrastructure. So the only taxpayer outlay that the state government has committed to this is infrastructure improvements. Well, they're widening roads from 1 lanes to 4 lanes and 2 lanes to 3 lanes. And those projects are already done. So the state has already spent committed money for this And it's hard for me to describe how big this facility is in Ohio. I've driven past it. You can't see one side to the other. I mean, it will take you 40 minutes to drive a complete square around the entire project. So I'm anxious to see in January if this comes up. I think it will in the House. I think the Speaker really is interested in ending this. I'm also interested to see if it was just campaign talk from President Trump or if he's actually committed to stopping this, and where will it lead to smaller communities across the country who have a vested interest in this.
Well, and you mentioned some different Republicans who have been invested in this. What was kind of the divide when the act passed? Was it bipartisan? Was it along party lines?
No, it was truly bipartisan. I feel like I don't exactly know the number in the House, but a significant number of Republicans and Democrats voted for it. It passed significantly in the Senate. It was easy. And it's honestly, for me, I haven't paid much attention to it as a journalist because it was such an easy pass and everyone seemed to support it.
Well, JD, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and JD. You've been listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the new congressional leadership, we'll return to Dan McCaleb.
Republicans will once again have a majority control of the U.S. House by the slimmest of margins after a few more races were called this week. House Speaker Mike Johnson of Louisiana will keep his leadership position. In the U.S. Senate, the Republican majority there selected Senator John Thune of South Dakota to be majority leader. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, let's start in the Senate. Thune wasn't the only Republican to seek the majority leader position, but in the end, he won out. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's right. There was an intense three-way race for the Senate majority position. Senator John Cornyn of Texas, Rick Scott of Florida, and John Thune of South Dakota. The way the process worked is they had votes this week, secret ballot on Wednesday. And if nobody got, I believe it was 27 votes, then they dropped off the third candidate on the list, who was Rick Scott. And then it was between Cornyn and Thune won out. Now, there was some hope among a lot of Trump's strongest supporters that Rick Scott, who's by far a lot more conservative than either Thune and Cornyn, wasn't going to be able to win. Charlie Kirk endorsed him. Elon Musk endorsed him. There was a really kind of a grassroots campaign to quickly cobble these votes together, but the Senate would not be pressured, and they don't like to be too pressured in these kinds of things. And so Thune won out. I mean, a little bit about Thune. Thune, he's 63, South Dakota. He's a pretty fit guy. Says he likes pheasant hunting. He's been in Senate leadership for a long time, for several years. He's worked closely with McConnell in that time. He has been a kind of a Republican leadership insider for a while. He hasn't been super outspoken against Trump, but he did not really go along with Trump on the whole 2020 election stuff. He was kind of critical of that and around January 6th. Notably, he also endorsed Tim Scott for president in the primary briefly. So that's kind of interesting thing. So he's not particularly a Trumper, but now he's saying that, he wants to work with the president. He's willing to work on recess appointments, which, by the way, Trump did not endorse anyone, but he said whoever the majority leader is needs to agree to recess appointments so they can quickly get his cabinet in place.
So what does that mean, a recess appointments?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, like, who knows, because it's a kind of a complicated legal scholar question to constitutional lawyers. But the simple version of it is that the founding fathers allowed provision for a president to appoint cabinet members in the event that Congress was out of session. Now, of course, back then, when they went out of session, I mean, they would, go home. And going home could be a long journey, could take a long time. And so they didn't have airplanes, of course. And so coming in and out of session the way we do now was not really an option back then. And so sessions, were longer. And then when they were out of session, that time was longer. Now Congress goes out of session, everybody flies home for a few days, they can come back into session. So session coming in and out is just different. But back then, because session could be out for so long, they allowed for recess appointments. So the president could temporarily appoint a cabinet position. It's actually not just cabinet. There's like 1,000 positions that need Senate confirmation. But he could appoint it, and then this position, I think, would last for 1 year without Senate approval. So lest anyone thinks now fast forward to modern day, lest anyone thinks that Trump is trying to do some legal maneuvering of emperor style evil. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama all used recess appointments, like over 100 for George Bush and Bill Clinton. And then Obama started doing it. But in 2014, the Supreme Court basically ruled that it was being abused and that Congress had to be out of session for more than 10 days to do a recess appointment because, they were trying to do these recess appointments basically on the weekend when Congress was gone. And so the Supreme Court said that really violates the spirit of what the founders wanted. If Congress is going to be back in 2 days, you just need to wait for them. So ever since then, to avoid for letting the president do recess appointments, Congress is never out of session for more than 10 days. Even if they're not really in session, they will create a fake session not fake, it's a real session, but it's not really in the same way a session in the sense that they're going to do a lot. They just create the session to prevent the president from doing recess appointments. So what does that all mean for us now? Trump has control of the House and the Senate, and he might be able to finagle getting a time of, more than 10 days of Congress actually being adjourned and just appoint, 1,000 people. That could probably go to the Supreme Court too. It's going to be interesting to see. It hasn't really been tested to that measure since that 2014 Supreme Court case.
Casey, let's switch our focus in the brief time that we have left to the U.S. House. Republicans will maintain their majority in the House. Under the Biden administration, Republicans had a slight majority. It looks like they'll have a slight majority now. They needed 218 seats to have the majority. I'm looking at Decision Desk right now. It's been called for 219 Republicans with a handful of races still outstanding. One, it's still amazing. Well over a week past the election, we still are counting votes in some states, but that's neither here nor there for this conversation. During the Biden administration, with House Republicans in the majority, they launched all kinds of investigations into the administration. They impeached Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, among other things. What do you see a House majority doing with their subpoena power in a Trump administration? You think they'll continue to investigate the Biden administration looking backwards, or is their focus going to be on Donald Trump's agenda?
I think that a lot of Trump supporters want them to focus on the agenda. I'm sure there's plenty of subpoenaing to do, and you already see, the House Oversight Committee has continued to do that. So they're going to have more teeth for some of these investigations, but lately these congressional investigations haven't gone too far. I think if there is some serious declassification, which is what a lot of, potential cabinet picks and people are talking about, we need to declassify more documents to reveal what's been going on in the government. And then that could lead to some real serious investigations. I think the biggest win for Trump on this is he's going to be able to get, continuing resolutions passed. I think there could still be a government shutdown that, here in a few months because the Democrats are going to want to push through some long spending bill. And I think a lot of Republicans are going to say the American people just elected Donald Trump and we need to do a temporary funding so that when Trump takes office and the new, House and Senate are in position, they can make a longer term spending bill. So I think there's a real fight brewing there. And then also Trump's not going to get impeached probably. So that's a big win for him. If, Democrats had the House, that impeachment would probably be coming.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. Why is California Governor Newsom looking for federal waivers for the state's emission policies? What will education policy look like under the Trump administration? And what are the real-world impacts of the Federal Reserve's latest rate cut? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. A New York judge has postponed a decision regarding the potential dismissal of President-elect Donald Trump's hush money conviction. This comes in light of the U.S. Supreme Court's recent ruling on presidential immunity and Trump's victory over Vice President Kamala Harris in last week's election. Judge Juan Merchan granted a one-week pause to allow prosecutors time to consider how to move forward. The case is now on hold until November 19th, giving prosecutors the opportunity to respond to Trump's motion to dismiss the case entirely after his election win. 7 weeks into recovery efforts after Hurricane Helene, 7 people are still unaccounted for in North Carolina. The Category 4 hurricane, which initially made landfall in Florida on September 26th, has resulted in a total of 231 deaths across 7 states. North Carolina has reported 102 fatalities, with Buncombe County alone accounting for 43 of those. New York City is ending its controversial program that gave newly arriving migrants debit cards preloaded with money to pay for food, baby supplies, and other necessities. The Adams administration announced on Thursday that it was winding down the program that has distributed more than $3.2 million in debit cards to about 2,600 migrant families living in hotels under the city's right to shelter law. The mayor did not give a reason for ending the program, which was set to expire by the end of this year. After significant Republican wins in state legislative races, Texas Governor Greg Abbott announced he now has sufficient support to pass school choice legislation in the next legislative session. Abbott emphasized that school choice, along with property tax reform, will be the top priorities for consideration when the legislature reconvenes in January. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick also affirmed that school choice is the Texas Senate's leading priority. Previous efforts to pass school choice legislation in regular and special sessions 2 years ago failed in the Republican-controlled House. Emergency care services in the eastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan may soon be inaccessible as WellPath, the health care provider for the Michigan Department of Corrections, has failed to pay millions owed to local emergency services. State lawmakers called for an audit in September to investigate MDOC and WellPath's management of a $590 million contract. Reports indicate nearly $6 million remains unpaid to at least 15 ambulance services statewide. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on California's emission policies and why Governor Gavin Newsom is seeking federal waivers, we'll go to Cole Lauterbach.
Today we'll be discussing California Governor Gavin Newsom taking off in his jet to D.C. to seek federal emissions waivers from President Joe Biden before he leaves office and President-elect Donald Trump takes office, and what that means for Californians and other states who follow what California does because they're the ones with the waiver. Joining me is California reporter Kenneth Schrupp. Kenneth, first off, what exactly is Governor Newsom asking from the Biden administration to do, and why does he have to do it?
Hey, Cole. Newsom is in D.C. asking the EPA to approve 8 environmental waivers from the Environmental Protection Agency. California is the only state in the country that's allowed to create its own emission standards under the EPA because its emission standards predated the EPA because our smog in Southern California just got so awful in the early 20th century that we had to start taking action on our own. Now, California is allowed to keep regulating its own pollution and emissions, but for each of these new regulations, it has to get approval from the EPA. And so these 8 rules that have been adopted by California without EPA waiver approval, it doesn't seem like they're very enforceable. And this matters a lot because over a dozen states, which cover about 40% of the cars in the U.S. and 26% of the heavy-duty vehicles in the U.S., they've already signed on to California's air standards. So if these aren't approved, then it'll be a challenge for these states to follow through with enforcement of California's air rules on their own citizens. So let's go through and take a look at some of these policies that Newsom is seeking waivers for. The first main one is Advanced Clean Cars 2, which requires rapid electrification of cars, ending in a complete ban on new gasoline cars starting in 2035. And there's a similar rule for heavy-duty trucking called Advanced Clean Fleets. Other rules under consideration by the EPA are California's ban on gas-powered yard equipment and a requirement that ships that are in California ports use emissions filters that have something called a burn-off, where the built-up residue is actually supposed to catch on fire to clear itself off. Unfortunately, this causes massive ship fires, and so the Coast Guard said it's just not going to enforce this rule. So maybe the EPA won't approve this one. Other rules include separate phase-outs of diesel-powered trains, which usually get goods from ports inland, diesel-powered refrigeration in cargo trucks, which is big because most of the nation's fruit is grown in California and needs to be refrigerated and sent out to the rest of the country, and phase out of diesel-powered agricultural and construction equipment, which would make food and construction more expensive.
And what you just ran through, thinking about this, and I grew up, my father owned a trucking company for some time that had those refrigerated vehicles, trailers. This represents a request for permission to change the way that things are moved from the western coast in California throughout the country in ways that are so profound that I can't even begin to even imagine the pricing differences, the availability differences. The supply chain would be deeply, deeply affected if Governor Newsom is able to get permission from the outgoing Biden administration in ways that, just each and every single one of those, from refrigerated trailers to the requirement of trains alone, thinking about things that are hauled in and imported from Asia is wild. And that's not even considering the requirement that, so many new light duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles adopt these new standards to the point where in, as little as a decade, you won't be able to purchase a non-electric vehicle in the state of California. I can't imagine that this is going to cross the president's desk and he's not going to at least have somebody asking him to give this a little pause.
One thing I saw the Biden administration mention in a story with the LA Times is they want to make sure that the rules that they approve are going to be durable. That means that they could be looking at a rule under which Congress has the power to review all of these waivers within 60 legislative days. This means that even if Biden were to approve the waivers now, Congress would have the ability to reject each of them or as many as they like, given the power of congressional review. This means that Newsom may have already waited too long to push for these waivers. Another thing I want to point out is that 40% of all U.S. imports come in through California, and I believe 30% of exports come out through California's ports. This means that even if these rules only end up applying within California, we could see major increases in the cost of goods and significant delays in getting imported goods through the ports in California.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see the economic ramifications of this if President Biden even approves one of them, not only if it gets shot down by the incoming Republican Congress, or if we just simply see lawsuits saying that, interstate commerce, which is protected by the U.S. Constitution, would be upended by any number of these proposed environmental measures.
Right, and that's why 24 states have signed on to a lawsuit against the Advanced Clean Fleets, this trucking law, claiming that it does violate the Interstate Commerce Clause. And we're going to see that continue to move through the courts.
Kenneth, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Cole and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on what to expect on education from President-elect Donald Trump, let's now return to Eliana Kernodle.
With the victory of Republican candidate and former President Donald Trump for President of the United States, his campaign positions on education will become focal points for parents, educators, and school leaders in the coming months and years. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brennan Clary. Brennan, Trump has taken some strong stances on education. What are they?
Yeah, probably the strongest one, the one that I see the most often in education circles, is that he said he would abolish the United States Department of Education. That's the big one. I think there's been a lot of hand-wringing. There's been a lot of ink spilled on what exactly that'll look like, what exactly that'll mean. And I've seen some more nuanced approaches that are saying, okay, to be fair, this has been a conservative talking point since the 1970s, 1980s. He's not the first one to say we need to abolish the Department of Education. Has it ever happened yet? No. So I think, and he was in office before. He said a lot of strong things, leading up to that too. And that portion of the federal government came through unscathed. So I do think that there is some nuance that we need to take when we approach this, right? Of thinking about that sort of historical context, thinking about a previous administration under Trump. But, he did say that he would do it. I think that, at the very least, you can expect some changes. And I think too, Frederick Hess, who is a senior fellow and director of education policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, he said Trump couldn't really dismantle the Department of Education through executive order. It wouldn't be as easy as taking a pen out and saying okay, it's gone. I'm getting rid of it. So he would have to use legislation. And, unless the Republicans abolish the filibuster, they need the House majority and 60 votes in the Senate to make such a move. The House of Representatives is still up for grabs. So as of this recording on Tuesday, there's still a number of seats that are undecided and we're waiting on results for those. So it's possible that he could have all three, the House, the Senate, and so there might be some of that legislation that comes through that says we're going to severely revamp that federal agency. But I think it's safe to say you can see that there's going to be some changes coming. There might be some big drastic cuts. Also in terms of policy, one of the big things that Trump is pushing is school choice measures, right? We've seen a lot of conservative states having those kinds of fights. Like Texas, for example, there was a lot of back and forth between Governor Abbott and then Republicans from predominantly rural areas in Texas, where they oppose school choice measures because that would generally mean, in their view, that would mean less money going to their traditional public school. And that's sometimes one of the largest employers, right, in a small rural town. So there's a lot of backlash from those communities for Republicans who would be in favor of school choice. So Republicans were saying, I'm not going to vote for school choice measures in the Texas legislature, but Governor Greg Abbott has pushed special sessions for school choice issues and has essentially, endorsed candidates for this election, and was claiming victories in those races where he was endorsing those candidates who back school choice, right? So I think that is shows that there is a big conservative appeal for school choice, and if you frame it the right way, as we've seen from some polls leading up to this, a lot of parents, even teachers, are okay with. Or happy with some amount of choice, or potentially education savings accounts that allow students to go where they want to go, works best for them. So I think framing that the right way, I think a lot of people are weary of vouchers and some of that language of moving public school money to private schools. I think that would kind of raise some alarm bells for a lot of people who want strong traditional public schools and want those to be funded well. But that's a big thing that the Trump administration has said and is in the Republican platform. There's also a lot of hand wringing I see about Project 2025. That's a sort of blueprint for the next conservative administration that was released several months ago, I think. And I think the question is how much advice from that will Trump take. It's hard to say what's going to happen with that. I think mostly. I think that can lay out, okay, here's our grand vision. Again, there's often a grand vision, and then in reality, here's what we can get done. Here is what the political force behind it is, So I think Project 2025 is more like a wish list from some of these advocacy organizations that are very conservative, rather than here's how you do it, step A, step B, step C. But I think the takeaway is it's going to look very different than it is under the Biden administration. So the Department of Education currently, the Office of Civil Rights there has threatened to take away federal funds from schools that remove books and create a hostile environment for LGBTQ plus students. And I think that we can expect things to go the other way. We can see the Trump administration's Office of Civil Rights maybe going after schools that have books. I mean, it might be more like an Arkansas model where there's a bit more of the let's try to remove explosive material from libraries. And so I can see things kind of shifting the other way. And again, too, I've written about how the Office of Civil Rights has been silent on specific school districts, basically segregating teachers and students by race to discuss, topics about racial identity and equity. And, I can see the Department of Education, changing a lot on its positions on those kinds of things and saying like, that's not allowed. We're going to investigate, and sort of that enforcement arm. I can see that being more of a tool, for, what is traditionally, Republican or conservative leaning sort of agenda. You have to ask the question of like, is the Department of Education more useful in its current state, but can be kind of used for these ends, or is it better to be gone and have sort of a smaller government approach? So it's a very interesting question. I think that, we're going to have to see who's in charge of it, or how who's in charge of the House and Senate as well. And if there is actually, going to be action on those threats to abolish the Department of Education.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss the latest Fed rate decision and its impacts, it's PhD economist, Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, when the Fed does what the Fed does, I think that there are people that are sort of on the sideline, regular Americans, and they're like, yeah, interest rates are coming down. That's awesome. My mortgage rate that, it's going to be available to me is coming down. And sometimes yes and sometimes no. I mean, we had a 50-point basis cut, earlier this year. And people got excited about, rates, in particular on mortgages. They bounced down to about 6%. And then they went kind of right back up to 7%. I wanted to talk about what ultimately, when a Fed rate cut comes and they drop the rate quarter point, 4.5 to 4.75%. What does it mean? What does it mean to real people? What can you see in the economy that's going to be beneficial to you?
I think, first of all, people need to understand that the Fed puts a floor on interest rates. Well, what it means is you can't get any lower rates than that.
Yes.
But that doesn't guarantee that rates will fall to the floor, right? Rates could stay elevated. Second thing is, markets are forward looking. So all of the borrowing costs that you as a household face, whether it's your credit cards or mortgage rates, rates for auto loans, personal loans, they tend to reflect that pricing is already reflected, right? These expectations about future rate cuts are already reflected in the current pricing and the current rates that you're facing today. For example, the thought that the economy was cooling, the expectation that the economy was cooling rapidly, and that inflation was coming down fast back in July and then again in August, is the reason why mortgage rates dropped. And so that drop was basically took place in anticipation of, not as a result of, right? And so what I would want to say to people, families, households, people just out there listening and wondering what it means for them, is that basically the pricing that you're getting today is already incorporating future Fed rate cuts, right? Or at least what the market believes will come in 2025. And so if those rate cuts are not realized, in other words, if the economy comes in stronger than expected and the Fed does not cut as fast or by as much as it signaled, interest rates could go up again, right? From where they are right now.
Interest rates offered to the consumer.
That's right. Interest rates offered to consumers, right? So fewer rate cuts from the Fed, or basically, a lower magnitude of rate cuts from the Fed between now and next year, could actually cause interest rates on mortgages, auto loans, personal loans, and credit cards to actually increase from here. Which is why I tell people, if you're going to borrow, waiting is risky.
The rate today, just as I'm checking it again, and when, we're recording this on November 8th, 6.79%. Those were the rates as of the close of business on November 7th, average from Freddie Mac for a 30-year
your mortgage rate. Yeah, 30-year fixed. That's right.
And the 15 is at 6, and that spread is pretty much on par with what I think we've seen for a while, 0.75 of a point, 0.89.
And let me add something to this. If markets begin to believe that policies that will be enacted in the new administration's first 100 days in office could be inflationary or even just really push up economic growth, then that potentially means fewer rate cuts from the Fed, which could push mortgage rates higher, rates on almost everything, right? Long-term rates higher than we have them right now. And so I say, to the incoming administration to be very, very careful, because I think the people who elected this administration are hoping for the administration to make policy that will help them navigate the current economy, that will help them keep inflation low, right? One of the mandate is to keep inflation low and to keep people in their jobs. And so any policy that's coming next, or any, movement that could cause higher uncertainty in the markets could potentially result in higher interest rates for the consumer. Hopefully, I'm hopeful that as we go forward into 2025, we get more stability, less volatility, that we get fewer, random policy ideas thrown around in the news carelessly, I want to say, because that could actually hurt the people who actually elected this new administration in the first place. And so remember, the bond market, traders, investors are in control. They remain in control. And so we can throw policy ideas around. If people start to believe that the U.S. economy, that the debt accrued by our government is increasing too fast, then the cost of that debt is going to increase. If fiscal policy is on a path and fiscal deficits are on a path that investors believe to be unsustainable, then it will show up in higher interest rates. And so I say to be careful going forward, regardless of what administration, right? We now have the election results. And so the administration has to be very careful about the types of policies, the rhetoric, right, that it uses even out in the press, in the media, because that will have a very strong impact on where consumer interest rates, or what happens to consumer interest rates.
I appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. The Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network, produced by Eliana Kernodle. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug, and on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.